We just wanted to welcome everyone to the NTI Transfer of Learning webinar. We're really glad to have you here today. We have representation from people in all of our pilot states on the webinar. So during this brief 1-hour webinar, we plan to introduce you to core concepts of transfer of learning and talk about how you can apply that to NTI. This is just an introductory, so for those of you who want to learn more, we encourage you to explore more in-depth the references and resources we provide on today's webinar. So before we get started, I just want to introduce everyone that's here in the room. My name is Emily Smith-Gehring, and I am one of the implementation specialists with NTI. I work with Oklahoma, California, and our tribal site.
Hi, it's Lisa Maynard, and I'm working as an implementation specialist in Maine, Minnesota, and Washington State. So welcome.
And good afternoon. This is Mary Wachanski. I'm pleased to be here today, and I'm currently working with Illinois, Tennessee, and South Carolina.
Great.
Hi, I'm Laura Arroyo, and I am the administrative assistant for NTI.
Great. Well, we're glad to have all of you here with us today. So before we jump into the content, we want to talk about today's goals. So we have a couple of simple goals of this webinar. The first one is that we really want to commit to transferring NTI learning into practice. And we know that's a really important part of the success of this initiative, is not just taking the training, but actually committing to transferring that learning. So we hope you walk away today with that commitment. The second is to know how to use several tools to support the transfer process. So we're not just going to talk about what is transfer of learning, but what are some activities and tools that you all can use in your states. And finally, we want to help you learn how to create a plan for NTI transfer of learning activities. That should be the third goal. So we have some tools to provide for action planning and how can you create an action plan for transfer of learning in your state and with your users. So what is the transfer of learning process? The transfer of learning process is an interrelated series of tasks performed by supervisors, trainers, learners, coworkers, and others before, during, and after a learning intervention in order to maximize transfer of knowledge and skills and improve job performance. So you can see from this definition that transfer of learning is not just one person's responsibility, but it's the responsibility of many. And we're going to talk more about this idea of before, during, and after the learning intervention and what are our strategies during those different times. But why is transfer of learning important? And this is a really critical question, particularly as it relates to our training initiative. Why do we want to participate in this process? I think first and foremost, improving our practice skills serves children and families more effectively. And that's the number one reason why we're doing this work. Another reason why this transfer of learning is important is that staff really want to feel equipped to perform their jobs well. So if you're in a job that you don't feel like you have the tools and resources to actually complete the job that you're doing, your satisfaction is really going to be pretty low in terms of your satisfaction in that role. And then last, learning interventions are resource heavy. And I think this one's really important is because that, while NTI has not had a financial impact on states, our investment of staff time has been significant. And I think each of you know that, is that staff time has really had to be committed to participating in this training. And so we really want to get out of this intervention what we put into it. I'm going to turn it over to Mary to talk a little bit more about what the research has told us about transfer of learning.
Okay, thanks, Emily. So what do we know about learning? One thing we know very clearly is that learners lose up to 70% of what we teach them in the first 24 hours. And that's a pretty astounding fact. But I do want to highlight it says up to 70%. So don't think that everybody loses 70% immediately, but it's up to 70% in the first 24 hours. So what we know is that the brain, from neuroscience, we understand that the brain is actually designed to forget. And the reason that that is so is that we have so much information in our minds that we're bombarded with and that we learn every day that if we held on to everything equally, we wouldn't make sense of really anything. And so again, it's actually functional and adaptive to have a brain that forgets. And so while this is normal from a neuroscience perspective, it's kind of frustrating from a training perspective because we spend a lot of time and energy teaching, and we really want our learners to learn. But if we're able to actually understand this phenomena and know what the brain is designed to do, we're actually able then to take action that will increase our ability for learners to remember what we want them to remember. Okay, next slide. So the forgetting curve. We talked a little bit about 70% of folks lose information within the first 24 hours. So if you look at the forgetting curve, this is in the public domain. This is what we understand in terms of forgetting information. The dip in the very first day is so significant. And then it tails out to the first week. So what do we find out? Well, we lose a lot of information within the first week, but we lose most of the information within the first day. So most of us have probably heard the old adage, use it or lose it. That's absolutely true when it comes to being able to remember information and then apply information. We're going to come back to that a little bit later, but the takeaway from this slide is to remember that this is not a random process. This is a normal process that happens to all learners. We know and can anticipate that whatever we teach will be forgotten if we don't take steps to enhance learning and memory. Okay, next slide. This is just another slide, and again, there's different data and different points and pieces that illustrate the fact that people do forget a lot of information, that they don't remember everything that they have acquired. So here we have a couple of different slides. But the takeaway is, again, as Emily spoke about, transfer of learning does not happen on its own. It's not osmosis. People don't learn something and then retain it and then have the ability to apply it. They need support and they need a lot of reinforcement. So this slide is really just saying that less than 10% of training actually gets transferred in the real world. And so when you think about if you're a training professional or someone who needs their staff to really learn and acquire new skills, this is a really important piece of data to pay attention to, because what we're most interested in is job performance. Do people learn information that they then can recall, change practice, and apply? So that sequence becomes critical, that they're able to remember the information. And then on the far right-hand side of the slide, less than 40% of trainees had applied less than 40% of their knowledge. So 40% of 40, wow, that's quite small 90 days after the event. Again, the three slides in a row are all illustrating the same point, which is transfer of learning has to be intentional. We have to work against the natural forgetting curve, and we have to do it in a timely way. Okay, next slide. So decline in skill after training. So let's suppose that people were able to learn a new skill, and let's suppose that they were actually able to apply that skill. Well, kudos to all those people who are working hard, because that's the very first task that people have. But what happens after the event is the decline in use of skills over time. And so when you look at that and you go 12 months out, look how little of the skill is retained. And we can start out really great. We can, folks are learning a new skill and they're practicing a new skill. But what we know is that if there is not deliberate, intentional, and planned interventions to support that continued use of skill, then they're going to have a decline in the skill. And so, it's estimated that only about 35% of the skills are still in use after 12 months in a typical training event. And so that's not, a terrific outcome. But we also know that we can do certain things to really move the needle up, and we're going to share a couple of those things that you might be surprised about, in fact, how easy they are to change that trajectory of downward decline. Okay, next slide. So this image is supposed to make you laugh a little bit. So really, a lot of us have gone through trainings, and we leave the training room, and we're supposed to figure it out on our own. We're supposed to figure out how to integrate the knowledge and the learning that we've had into skills, and then think about how to reflect upon our practice and improve it. Well, that's really what a lot of things are anticipated in terms of trainings to do. What we want to do is we want to create a lifeboat or a raft so that our learners are able to use the information, and instead of kind of thinking, we really want them to swim.
Okay. So, and Mary, I'm curious, if anyone did learn to swim that way by reading a book, if they would please put it in the chat box. We would love to hear.
Very, very, very important. Yes, it's, again, really important that we create some real-world examples and support throughout the training to help people so that they are not, in fact, thinking. Okay, so this is information that all of you know, but I want to reiterate some of the pieces, and we can talk about what do we want to do different. We know what doesn't work, okay, and so we don't need to spend a lot of time on that, but let's think about what does work. So reasons why training does not work as intended. Oftentimes people talk about, well, I went to a training, and that training window is I showed up in the classroom or I showed up online, I did the training, and that was over. What we really want to think about is extending the time frame for thinking about training as a long-term event to increase the beginning, the middle, and the end of what we consider to be the training period. So we're going to talk about that. We also want to think about not only extending that time frame, but not thinking about it as happening and being completed. While the training may be completed, we want to think about the training opportunities to be recurring, so over time. The second slide here, the second bullet here is lack of accountability. So that's a question that people wrestle with. Whose responsibility is it to make sure that the training is working as intended? We know that, simply delivering a workshop or a seminar, there's some accountability there in terms of the trainer, but who is responsible for making sure that the outcomes we're hoping to see actually take place in the workforce, in the day-to-day practice arena? So lack of accountability, we can certainly shift that by identifying who can be on the team to make sure that transfer of learning works. The job environment, being prepared or not prepared to support transfer, is also a reason why it may not transfer as well. Management, reinforcement, and support may be missing. Well, we do know for NTI, for example, we are really thrilled with the outcomes to date for the NTI completion rates and the engagement rates, and we know that we have shifted this reinforcement concept here with NTI, that management in our states is really on board and is reinforcing the idea that NTI has a value and that staff should participate, and they are supporting transfer of learning strategies, and we'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Failure to isolate the effects of training. Again, we're going to talk a little bit more about that, but it's really important that we think that if we're doing a training, we're doing it for a reason. It's really easy to say we're doing a training to improve skills, but what skills? How will we measure them? How will we know when folks are doing a better job? So isolating those effects of training becomes really critical. Sometimes there's a lack of leadership commitment, and sometimes there is a change in leadership. I think we all know that initiatives can come and go based on the leadership in place. So we want to make sure to combat the reason why lack of commitment or lack of staying power of leadership. We want to be able to have large tentacles in specific training and specific transfer learning opportunities by increasing the web of responsibility and the web of belief that transfer of learning practice is important and that people have various roles in going forward with transfer of learning activities. And then the failure to provide feedback regarding results. One of the things that really helps support transfer of learning and training is if we hear the data that supports the so what factor, and that means we've gone through the training, we've spent the time and the energy and whether it's money or resources to in fact complete the training, and so we need to hear often and frequently what results are we gaining from this initiative, and so we'll talk a little bit more about that. Again, the reasons why training does not work, we know these facts. The more important thing is how can we make training work as intended? And we're going to talk a little bit more on the subsequent slides about that.
Okay.
So the 6 key principles, these are just, I want to quickly go over these. We talked a little bit that learning is a process, not an event. Again, a workshop may be an event, but learning is a process. It's ongoing. Knowing is not the same as doing. We probably all know on pre and post tests we're able to demonstrate that we have knowledge, but a lot of us have a lot of knowledge about a lot of things, and we may not do those in day-to-day practice because it is much harder to shift practice than it is to shift knowledge. So we know that we're going to differentiate those two between knowledge and practice. passing isn't good enough. Okay, we all are familiar that in order to get credit for a particular course or a learning requirement, we have to get a certain score. And we're not, again, passing is really not our threshold. We want everyone to pass, but we really want everyone to learn and then to apply knowledge. Another principle is time is cost. Everyone's time out there who's listening to this webinar, who's leading a staff, who's working with families, knows how valuable their time is, and we know that it has a cost. So we want to maximize the potential contribution that learning can have to your outcomes. Training is everyone's responsibility, and what that means is that it can't be isolated in the training department. It has to be extended to supervisors, to team leaders, and to staff themselves who take training and learning as their own responsibility. The last principle here is one that we think about often, and that's really around that it takes a lot of work to transfer learning. And the other idea is that we are not intending to transfer the entire content of NTI into every state and every user. What we want to be able to do is shift practice, and sometimes that shift takes place with small steps. And so we're not looking for perfection. We're looking for a place to start, and we can see small changes just by doing things a little bit differently in key areas that are important to various states. Okay. And so Lisa's going to talk a little bit now about some other slides as we go forward.
Okay. So a key takeaway from this webinar is the concept of before, during, and after transfer of learning activities. These are activities that encourage learning transfer of skills and knowledge at different phases of the training implementation process. Each step is important. For those of you who have already finished the pilot, and I know there are many of them in several of our states, you're still in luck. There's still plenty that you can do in terms of transfer of learning. Art Cohn, an educator and researcher, says if your goal is to produce long-term retention, and if your goal is to produce behavior change, then what you do after the training is as important, if not more so, than what you do before and during the training. So this next slide, okay, this next slide is a transfer of learning matrix. So take a look at the slide, and you'll notice that there are different blocks, before, during, and after: supervisor, management, trainer, curriculum developer, and trainee. Think about the three roles: supervisor, trainer, trainee, and the time frames, before, during, and after. Take a minute to think about these roles and these concepts in terms of who do you think is the most significant and powerful in promoting transfer, and that would be number 1 on a scale of 1 to 9, and number 9 being the least significant, powerful in promoting transfer. So take a minute and think about where you would number the different blocks and the different concepts. If you have anything you'd like to share, then you can put your response in the chat box. Just type it in.
So Lisa, you're asking that folks take the numbers 1 through 9 and place them in the box that they think most corresponds with the most to the least powerful in promoting transfer, right?
Right.
So I'd have all 9 boxes completed with 1 number each. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay.
Yep. So where would you put number 1?
Feel free to share in the chat box your guess for number 1.
So number 1, we have someone saying trainer. Somebody else is saying number 1 would be trainer before. Another person says supervisor or manager. I'm not sure where that is, before, during, or after. Supervisor, manager before. So a lot of different answers. Okay. Someone says during the entire process. supervisor and manager during. Okay, so great, a lot of really great answers, good guesses.
So it looks like, Lisa, based on the chat box, that people think that each role has a significant contribution, and each time period could have a significant contribution. And people may differ on how significant that is. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm. Right. Yep. So let's take a look at what the research shows. So the research shows, actually, and hopefully this is going to start with number one. So number one, oh, okay. So as you can see this being populated, number one, and the answer is, number one is the supervisor management before the training is the most significant factor. And the trainee before is not quite as important. The trainer and the curriculum developer before the training is important, which makes sense. How are we setting up the curriculum? How is the training being developed? What's it looking like? And then, of course, the trainer and curriculum developer at the end has very little significance, which also, I think, makes a lot of sense. The fact that two of the top three most powerful combinations involve the manager showcase how important the learner's manager is to transferring what they've learned into job skills and job behaviors. But all too often we see the focus of learning is falling solely on the shoulders of the trainee or the trainer. And it's just not true.
Okay, so yeah.
Okay. So supervisors are instrumental in supporting the transfer of learning. They're most successful when assuming an encouraging or requiring response to staff development activities. So an encouraging response would be something that looks at discussing the training course with the staff before the training. Why is it important? How will it be useful in their work? Setting it up, right? Setting it up and getting some buy-in before they even get started. We all know that our staff are overworked. They feel like there's a whole lot of things there on their desks, a lot more to do than they may feel like they have time for. And adding a training oftentimes feels like way too much. But if we can set it up in such a way that can help the learners understand that this is going to be beneficial to their work, maybe even save time in the long run and help them to feel more successful, then the training might be more successful in the long run. The supervisor can attempt to create readiness to learn, going along those same lines. And then encouraging staff to applying the learning skills and knowledge after they've completed the training. A requiring response would be something about knowing what the staff member learned. So in supervision, talking about a concept, what did you learn from this? How might you apply this in your job? Providing coaching and feedback, and assessing achievement. All different ways to provide encouraging and requiring responses. So what should we avoid as management and supervisors when we're talking about transfer of learning? Well, nobody likes to hear "you better" or "else," right? So what we're going to avoid is taking a preventing or a discouraging or even a neutral position to professional development activities. We want to be encouraging and requiring rather than discouraging and setting up a negative expectation. So preventing positions sound like, I know what you learned in training, but we don't really like it and we don't do it like that. Or we've always done this work in this way. That's how we're going to do it. I know somebody says we should maybe change our habits, but just go ahead and take the training and we'll move on from there. And a neutral response would sound like, whatever makes you happy. Just as long as you get the work done. Yeah, I know we talked about that in training, but that just might not work for you, and that's okay. what we want to do again is going back to that encouraging or requiring language. So we want to be a cheerleader for the training and why it's beneficial to the staff.
So thanks, Lisa. And let's talk a little bit more about specifics around what sort of activities and actions do we need to be doing during that before, during, and after training. So you'll see here on this slide, this is about actions before training. And if you remember from the matrix that we showed you, the before training, what was most important was how supervisors and management responded, as well as the trainer or the curriculum developer. Really, the trainee doesn't have anything or any sort of responsibility prior to the training starting. So understanding the performance need is really important before the training begins. And I think a lot of you probably, if you were part of the planning team for NTI, remember having some of those conversations around why are we doing this and why is this important. And so that's a really critical element before you implement a training, before you begin it. And then that next bullet, which is related, is communicating the expected outcomes and benefits. So this is a really crucial step that I think is often missing, where we're not communicating down to the users why this is going to be beneficial to them and to their work and to their clients, and what outcomes do we expect of this. So this is really critical for engaging the trainee in the process. And these last two bullets you'll see are really more related to the person developing and presenting the curriculum. So when it comes to NTI, that was really a lot of the work that we did before we engaged the pilot states, where we were spending a lot of time putting thought into creating the training and really making it relevant for our child welfare workforce. This next slide is really about what are our actions during the training. So again, supervisors and management have a role in this, although during the training that role, according to the matrix, kind of decreases. Their role is really, really important prior to the training beginning. But just some ideas for how supervisors and management can engage during the training is, again, really focusing on goal settings. So setting goals with your team regarding the training. And this can be goals for when we're going to complete the training, how we're going to apply it, etc. Also providing an opportunity for practice and modeling. So one thing that we've really tried to emphasize in NTI is the use of tip sheets. And there are module-by-module tip sheets that provide supervisors and staff with ideas for how do we apply this training and how can we model this training in practice. So don't forget to use those, and if you do need access to those, again, please reach out to your implementation specialist. But there's really a lot of great ideas for applying the training. Another thing that's really critical for management and supervisors during the training phase is to participate. So don't just observe or monitor that your workers are completing the training, but actually complete it with your staff. Discuss with trainers what sessions would be most helpful or appropriate for you to attend. So, you know, in some circumstances, managers might not be able to attend all the training, but what is the core content that's really valuable for you all to be a part of? And when practical, really attending that training demonstrates your support of the trainers as well as the learners. And so another way to really work on that application review with NTI is to, if you are a supervisor or manager, to participate in the supervisor modules, which then give you some more ideas for application. How do you help your learners review what's in the training, and really start thinking about that after portion of the training. So how are they going to apply it, and how are they going to implement it into practice in an ongoing basis? And then lastly, we'll talk a little bit more about these actions for after the training. So remember the quote that Lisa shared with us from Art Cohen. If your goal is to produce long-term retention, and if your goal is to produce behavior change, then what you do after training is the most important. So this is really a critical element, and we know that a lot of you are in phases of the pilot where you're getting close, you have already completed all of the modules, your staff have already completed all the modules, or you're getting very close to that. So if you haven't been doing any of transfer of learning yet, it's not too late. You can still engage in some activities post-training that are really going to help embed this into your work. One of those things to do is really monitor the progress of action plans and revise those plans as needed. So we'll be talking here in the next few slides about how do you actually create an action plan. So creating a transfer of learning action plan is really critical. And this plan really should be revisited. There should be some conversations around, you know, who, what, where, when. So who's going to carry this out, and who is going to implement the action plan. So that's a really critical part after the training. We don't want to just complete the training and move on. This action plan really helps us move forward. Another way to encourage transfer of learning after the training is to conduct post-training debriefing and really revisit the material during this time or redo a lesson. So that can be a part of your action plan, is what are we doing post-training? 3 months from now, are we going to revisit our modules on attachment and talk about some key takeaways from that module, or our modules on loss and grief, just as an example. And those sort of specifics should be embedded into your action plan. And we're going to hear a little bit from states here about what some of the after activities are that they've done, but some of them have implemented these sort of actions. Another thing is to provide follow-up support. So give staff members opportunities to practice the training, not just during, but after. So if maybe during the training you were doing some group case consultations and applying some specific practice models, then doing that again later, not just as a one-time opportunity. Another is to provide opportunities for practice and feedback actually on the job. So not just when you're in the office discussing the training, but maybe outside of the office. What can you do with your staff outside of the office to implement some of these practices after the training? And another tool is really to tie these transfer goals to performance plans. So if these are tied to performance plans, these are something that we're looking at throughout the year, and it'll remind us to sort of revisit that content, revisit the items that we thought were important, or maybe that for a specific staff member was an area of growth. So really embedding that into a practice plan helps us think about the future and think about the year ahead. And, of course, reducing barriers is huge. So when Lisa talked about some of those really encouraging responses and responses to avoid, that's one of the ways that you're reducing barriers. So if staff come to you and say, well, our policy doesn't really allow for this practice, instead of saying, yeah, well, there's nothing that we can do about that, how can we help them reduce barriers and maybe think about ways that they can be a part of changing that policy or educating others on why these practices are important? So Mary's going to talk a little bit more about why this after component is particularly important and sort of how our learning decreases over time, or our knowledge gain decreases over time.
Sure. Okay, so we talked a little bit earlier about the forgetting curve and the brain's desire to want to lose information. And the way that we actually can get our learners to remember information is to make it relevant, but also the really important thing is, when do we make it relevant? So when we thought about, there was an earlier slide on how much we lose after 24 hours, it's really ideal to pulse information very quickly after a learning event. So for example, let's say that a state has a completion date of a particular module on a particular day. What they mean, and again, I realize that people are going to be completing it within a window, but what we want to do is make sure that we're sending out some type of booster event very close to that time frame, because if we don't, we're not going to recall the information. We're not going to remember the information. So you'll see here that there's a series of booster events. This is days after a training. That very first graph that I showed you about skill decline follows the same curve, which is You lose a ton of information after the first 24 hours. So what can we do? One of the things that's very, very simple to do for a supervisor is day after training. What you want to do is you want to remind your learner of something that was relevant in the training that they were supposed to have been completed. So, we all use email. We don't see our staff every day. But what you can do is you can send out some level of booster by email. And it's important that we think about what is a booster event. Well, a booster event is actually any event where we ask our learner to get in the remembering mode. So we're not telling them information. It's important we think about this. So if we're going to send out an email, we're not telling them something they should have remembered. We're asking them to remember something. So for example, if we were, and this is non-related to NTI, but very simply, if we were to say on a Thursday, what is it that you had for lunch on Wednesday? People would start thinking about, what did I have for breakfast? What did I have for lunch? What did I have for dinner? But the idea would be that as they're starting to remember those things, they're much more able to then link new information to that prior event. So when we're thinking about booster events, we're trying to get learners to increase what they consider to be the stickiness of information. And the stickiness is related to, am I in a remembering kind of activity within my thought process? Am I trying to remember something, and I may not remember it all, maybe grasping. What was that topic? What was that word they used for bias? So they're trying to search their memory, and then we're giving them information to fill in the details. So again, you can send something very, very simple that will get someone to think about something they should have learned or remembered, and even if they didn't remember it, they're going to start searching their brain, and then you're going to give them that information, and it's going to make it much more sticky, so they'll be able to remember that over time. What you'll see that is you'll see that there are 5 curves here. If you do periodic booster events, okay, and they can be very, very small. Again, it can be one morsel of a curriculum. It's not the entire lesson. It's not the entire module. It's a particular concept. If you're to send those out repeatedly, a couple of days apart, you completely change that use it or lose it principle. If you look at day 8, if you were able to send out a couple of booster events, look where you end up in terms of memory retention. You are way up top, as opposed to if you do nothing, by day 7 you're almost at the bottom. So again, these use it or lose it principles around boosters of memory, just again, this is a little small tip, but tips that you can use as supervisors to engage your learners to be thinking about their curriculum, to be searching their memory for something they may have heard or seen or watched on the video, and then you're giving them information. And again, these things may take a minute or 2 to send out, but they are going to drastically change the outcomes that you have in terms of memory retention of the information provided. So we hope that you'll consider some of the information. I know there is a link earlier on the slide to Art Cohen's work. He has a lot of examples of booster events by email. You can certainly look at his webpage to get more ideas. But again, that's something very, very easy to do. And if you put it in your task calendar, if you're a supervisor, remember, as Lisa showed you earlier, your role post-training is critical. And so if you're nurturing new learning, new skill development, new application, continuing that role, even if it's just a minute or 2 by email, will drastically change the outcomes that you have. So hopefully some of you will try some of those booster events.
Well, now we're going to hear from some real-life examples of states that are participating in NTI and ways that they have implemented some before, during, and after examples. So these are we have some state folks here that are going to talk a little bit, and we'll also provide some details from the states. So we're going to start with Oklahoma, and I wanted to talk about a great during activity that they're doing. It's also, I guess, would potentially qualify as an after, because they're reinforcing the learning after training modules. So the model in Oklahoma that they've used is called what we're calling transfer of learning coaches. So in Oklahoma, we have 2 cohorts out of our about 14 that are assigned transfer of learning coaches. And these are some experts in the adoption mental health field from outside the state agency that have volunteered their time to work with these 2 cohorts after they've completed each module and really be coaching around transfer of learning and the content from that module and how they can apply it to their cases. So we have Bonnie on from Oklahoma that I think is going to talk a little bit more about this, and she really spearheaded this where she created this model for these transfer of learning coaches and standardized it so all the coaches could be implementing it within their two groups consistently. So Bonnie, if you're on the line, I believe you can just press *6 to talk to the group.
Hello?
Hi, Bonnie.
Can you hear me? Okay, excellent. Hello. Yes, so our coaching has been going fantastic. The staff has really responded really well, and as we have allotted about an hour of time for each of our transfer of learning sessions, we have gone over each time to at least an hour and a half, if not two, as the staff continue to bring questions and case examples and just really in-depth processing of how to apply what's in the module to what they're experiencing every day.
And Bonnie, can you mention just kind of how it was set up or formatted in in Oklahoma?
Yeah.
I know, considering that a lot of us are in large states, that was kind of an issue as we were thinking about this.
Okay. Yeah, sure. We set up a PowerPoint that goes over probably just a maximum of 2 slides for each lesson to be able to keep it within that hour time frame. And another piece of it is, well, my group is in person, so I'm able to print out all of the handouts that are in the resources tab for each module, and I'm able to hand them to them in person every time I meet with them, which has been very helpful as well. The other cohort is spread across the state. So what we're doing there is setting up kind of like what we're on right now, the Adobe, but it's called Zoom, and they are meeting on a webinar platform for their transfer of learning sessions. And the coaches are still providing the handouts each time and utilizing the PowerPoint that goes over each of the main points for each lesson in each module. They just send the handouts in an email beforehand and encourage everyone to print them off and have them in hand as they start the transfer of learning session.
Great. Thanks, Bonnie. So you'll see, we thought of some different creative solutions there for the fact that staff are spread out, and really, these coaching sessions, whether they're in person or on the webinar, it provides a time for the teams to interact about the training, and it really reinforces their learning through discussion, review, and application. So it has been very helpful and interesting just to hear about what they're learning and gaining from the training. So I think next, Maine has an activity example that they did.
Yeah, and Maine is on holiday, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the activity that they conducted. Amy Taranko, the adoption supervisor, used a group supervision to do an activity where the staff around the table were identifying claiming behaviors, and this is in regard to Module 3 on attachment. Each person identified claiming behaviors connected with the physical, mental, emotional, and psychological safety, and each one wrote some statements on little sticky notes, and then walked around the room, put their sticky notes up on this poster, and then had a really rich and deep discussion about what creating safety looks like for kids and families. The feedback was really terrific on this activity. I got not only the message from Amy talking about what the activity was, but a number of her staff responded saying it was one of the best activities they had done, really cemented the concepts and had them thinking about safety in a different way and from that psychological, social, and emotional perspective of the child that they really hadn't considered before in such a deep way. So again, getting people together in the same room, having a discussion around something like attachment and this one particular concept that can cement attachments, facilitate healthy attachments for kids, and what does creating safety look like. So they were really happy with that and felt like it really helped to, again, cement that learning taken from the NTI training and bringing it into their everyday practice.
Great, and last I think we have an example here from Tennessee.
Yeah, so thank you. What I was noticing just before we get into Tennessee from the example in Oklahoma and Maine was really the power of peer interaction. And while this is an online training and people are learning a ton on their own, really being able to discuss and process the information with peers seems to be like a very significant component of really making sure that the learning is transferring. So some terrific ideas. There's an example here from Tennessee, and I don't know, I think there may be someone on the line from Tennessee. I'll give a moment in case. What we wanted to highlight in Tennessee was really their use of their Transform grant. And if there's anyone on the line from Tennessee, I will give them a moment to pop in and see if they'd like to talk about it. If not, I'm certainly happy to go ahead and talk. But I always like to hear from folks in the state they're in. So is anyone on from Tennessee? *6 is to unmute yourself. Okay, that's fine. I will go ahead and kind of share a little bit about something that Tennessee was doing. They were very fortunate in that they have another grant, and they were able to use and leverage one of their other grants to extend the work of NTI. And so one of the things that they wanted to do was to take a look at what piece of the curriculum did folks have an interest in exploring and improving practice in. And they identified that the practice of life books was something that they really wanted some more support in. And so they had a couple of folks who were acting as kind of consultants who worked in various regions. I think it was 3 or 4 regions, to take a look at what was the current life book practice, what did they want to shift, how could they go about doing that. And so what they knew was that undertaking a practice, just one practice statewide, was going to be a significant lift. And so what they wanted to do was try a pilot in a couple of different regions to see if they could make changes in their life book practice. And I know they're working really diligently on trying to take a look at what currently the as-is state of what they're doing, and then think about how they would like to modify it. And so again, they picked, one practice that was really important to them that they felt was going to give them much better information on the children and families they serve, and then work with those teams to figure out how to improve that practice. So again, this is a longer-term kind of shift in practice, and again, they're starting it as a pilot, and hopefully what they learn they will then share statewide. But again, this was just another example from how Tennessee was taking a specific practice, and rather than picking the entire curriculum, they were prioritizing based on the needs of their users what was going to be most impactful or most important for them at a particular point in time. And so we'll certainly share more on future calls about Tennessee's work. But again, they have a nice piece of work going on with regard to life books. So that was actually being spearheaded by 2 individuals in Tennessee, Julie Flannery and Jan Dick. So thank you to them for doing the work. And Bonnie Beneke is the project lead in Tennessee, who is also involved in this work. So thank you to those who are doing that.
That's a great point too, Mary, is that as Lisa talks more here about action planning, that we are learning so much in NTI, and really focusing on or picking a few practice improvements that are also in line with some of the priorities of your state is a really good place to start when action planning. So we'll turn it over to Lisa to talk more about that.
So we're going to start talking about how we might pull together a plan for transfer of learning. So you might start by thinking about what is one performance improvement I want to see. And Mary mentioned this earlier about, I believe, the work in Tennessee, about how they've decided to choose one performance measure to keep track of and to figure out how NTI is impacting that one performance measure. So think about one important performance improvement that you would like to see. and maybe take a minute to just jot it down on a piece of paper in front of you. And what is the criteria that would measure the success of that improvement? How do you know it's working? So think about that for a moment, and if you like, you can use the chat function to share ideas of the performance improvement areas you'd like to see in your state or on your team. So I'll give you a moment to think about that. So I don't see any ideas that are showing up at the moment, but Mary, do you want to talk about lifebooks and how Tennessee has decided to use lifebooks?
So Tennessee is actually using lifebooks as one idea for a practice improvement area. And so I'm not, to be honest, since I don't know that anyone is on the line from Tennessee who might take a look to see how they're actually looking to see and relate it to performance improvement. But for example, here's something, and I'm going to just say this might be an idea. I don't know if they're doing this, but let's say that they can't find evidence that there was any work done in lifebooks on page 4. Let's say they have a standard form, and page 4 is routinely missing. And what they might decide to say is that they're going to look at all charts in a particular region, and they're going to monitor page 4. And maybe before they start the project, 50% of pages are missing on page 4. And perhaps after the work they do in lifebooks in terms of really expressing how important this is, creating a different work process, making sure the right workers are actually responding to that page, they might go back in 6 or 9 months and take a look at how many of page 4 are now completed. So what that example does is it takes this idea that they want to have complete, coherent lifebooks created. And right now, the current condition is that parts of these materials are missing. And so their goal might be for 95%, okay, we're not going to get to perfection, but 95% of the lifebook documents are complete in its entirety. So they have a very measurable goal. They have a doable goal. They know the workers have the skills to do it. Perhaps they've mapped out a business work process in terms of how to complete it in time frames. So they would be able then to be very clear about what the performance goal is. Maybe they want to move it from baseline of being completed 50% of the time, and after 6 months, perhaps they want it to go to 75% completion, and then within a year, perhaps the 95% goal. But what they know is that that one performance improvement goal is doable, it's measurable, it's attainable, and that they've also identified one person whose role it will be to monitor that work improvement process. So again, I'm kind of giving you an example that may or may not be in place in Tennessee, but it's something related to the work they're doing there.
Yeah, and I think the important piece of this is they picked out a very discrete task, one improvement that they wanted to see, and it's related to the NTI. So there is the module that talks about life books and digital stories and the importance of a child talking about their story and having a chronicle of who they are and where they are. And so that's a real good measurement for that. Okay, building your plan. How do you build a plan for transfer of learning? Think about who needs to be involved. Who on your team is going to help this transfer of learning take place? Who are the key people that can make it work? When is the transfer of learning plan, the ideas that you put into place, how are they going to get done? And how are we going to make it happen? For a planning tool, an action plan has 4 main elements. Again, isolate discrete steps that are realistic, measurable, and attainable. Again, the life books was a really great example of that, I thought. Identify clear responsibilities for learners, supervisors, workers, and trainers. What needs to be done by whom and by when? Answering all those questions. 3, develop a specific time schedule for completing the activities. And then 4, identify resources necessary to get the job done. So making sure all these elements are included in a transfer of learning plan. And I just want to note that we have a matrix and some other resources available on our pilot site materials on our website. So please do take a look at those resources on our website. Mary talked about sending emails and boosters and those kinds of things. We're talking about push and pull to reinforce the transfer of learning. So sending an email that includes an exercise, a quiz, something to grab your staff's attention, that would be a push. Reinforcing a skill via a link to learning resources is a pull. So finding ways to get this information out to staff so that they're feeling sort of constantly supported in this and reminded so that that forgetting curve, so it gets lessened, right, reduced. Yep.
Well, I know that we're short on time here, and we wanted to leave time for question and answer, but many of you might have to hop off since we've reached the end of the webinar. If you do have questions, please type them into the chat box, and if you have to go and don't have time to respond, we can, of course, send out responses to those questions later. But we'd love to take some questions at this time. If you have some, please put them in the chat box.
So there was one question that just popped up a few minutes ago, and it was referring to where do I find more information on booster activities. And on slide number 6, there is a link to a website. You can go ahead and visit that website. It'll give you some ideas for boosters and things you might want to try via email. So thanks for that question.
Are there any other questions?
We can hang out for a couple of minutes while you're thinking of questions and just put them in the chat box. We'd be happy to stay and answer as people are jumping off to go back to other tasks.